Hello, welcome to Hard Compound, an American take on Formula One. We are still in the silly season, still nearly 2 months away from the first race of Formula One 2022. But we want to talk about all things Formula One and especially our favorites, our favorite drivers, our favorite teams, tracks, locales, media personalities, all of that good stuff. We have a content rich episode for you. Patrick, son, are you ready?
I am ready to go.
Tell me, what is your favorite team?
I don't know if I have necessarily a favorite team. I think the team I root for most or most frequently, at least in recent seasons, probably has to be Alpine and just before that Renault. They're kind of a fun, scrappy team, one of sort of the big constructors, I guess you could say, seeing as how they do sort of everything in house. I think they have fun drivers. Alonso is one of my favorite drivers, and Ocon is fun. And for whatever reason, I tend to like all things French. So they right now are probably my favorite team.
That's a great one. I think Alpine is up there for me as well. Alpine slash Renault. I love the team itself as it's configured right now with Alonso and Ocon. I always love the livery. I love their history when you think of them as Renault, that they're a true constructor, as we've said before. They really do try to put together a Formula One car from powertrain to aero, everything. I think my favorite team would be McLaren. On very rare instances, I do see a McLaren driving down the streets. In the US, you will never see an Alpine, and it's extremely rare. Even say in California, where cars will last 30 and 40 years, to see a Renault. I do get to see Alpine. I love the colors, the color scheme for McLaren, the history of the team. I love that, just a few years ago, they were as woeful as Haas was this year. And now they're up in the points competing for the third spot. They got a great young talent in Lando Norris. I like that. I'm always rooting for Daniel Ricciardo. So, and Zach Brown, the American Zach Brown. I mean, he's really, I think, not only has he done a great job in making McLaren competitive, I think he's going to have an impact on Formula One for another decade. He's just, bringing sponsors, visibility. He's doing such a great job. So for me, I think it would be McLaren.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good one. They're definitely up there for me too. I think, like McLaren and Ferrari would probably round out my top three. They're kind of the two big guns, the historic, iconic constructors in Formula One. I would equate them to sort of the Yankees and Red Sox in the MLB. And it's kind of hard not to acknowledge their history and impact on the sport. And they're both fun to watch, I think.
Right. And especially if you're new to F1, choosing, say, Mercedes, for example, as your favorite team, that's an easy one. They've had the best car for the last 7 or 8 years, and they'll likely continue to compete for the top spot for several more. There's Ferrari, as you said. I mean, just the storied brand, the history. It's an amazing car. It's sort of like being new to soccer and choosing Manchester United or moving from Europe to the US and choosing the Yankees as your baseball team. So those are other great ones. What about driver? Can you pick a favorite driver? Only one.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, a lot of the guys on the grid you kind of want to root for. I think, when I first became acquainted with the sport, I sort of randomly chose a favorite driver, knowing nothing really about the sport. And it happened to be Fernando Alonso. And he has sort of been my favorite driver since then. So I would say Alonso. he's kind of always been my favorite driver. But if I had to really pick somebody else, I think that I frequently rooting for Charles Leclerc. There's no real basis for it. I just kind of like him and want him to do well. And so those are probably my two favorites on the grid right now.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I think Alonso is up there for me. I'm considerably older, and I was introduced to Formula One way, way back before most of the world was born, on Saturday afternoons with Wide World of Sports and ABC TV. So I still have a special place in my heart for Jackie Stewart. He was great back then. I think he had left the sport as a driver, but he had a team. He was doing a lot of commercial work. He was doing a lot of announcing in the US and really sort of bringing the sport to the US and really made racing just seem so great. So I think if I were to say favorite, it might still be Sir Jackie Stewart. If I were to choose favorite current driver, I think I would be with you with Alonso. Since he burst onto the scene, I think only Max Verstappen can sort of equal him in just sort of pure talent and willingness to do whatever it takes to win, ability to get as much out of the car as any other driver. I think Max has sort of the meticulousness that Lewis Hamilton has, combined with sort of the pure driving talent that Alonso has. So I think Max, we may be watching the greatest driver ever. Time will tell. But I think current driver is Alonso for me. What about, do you have a favorite younger driver? Not necessarily an F2, but even just on the grid for 2022.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good young drivers and kind of exciting guys. And I kind of like the fact that F1 teams aren't necessarily afraid to put a young guy in a car. I think there are a few that I enjoy. As far as on the grid in 2022, I would have to say Mick Schumacher. I think that's kind of an obvious one, but just having a Schumacher on the grid is pretty awesome. And he seemed to handle himself pretty well thus far in his career. And he just seems like a really bright young driver to bring to the sport. And I do think that like that name holds weight and that just him being a part of this sport sort of brings it to new heights and reaches a wider audience, which I think is definitely a good thing for the sport as well.
Yeah, I was very impressed with Mick Schumacher's first season. I think he handled himself well in front of the media, the fans, given all that his name means to the sport. And even though he was on a terrible team in a terrible car, Haas, he always seemed to try to do his best, get the most out of that car every race. I don't know what his ceiling is yet, and maybe it's already been reached, but he's certainly shown that even though he's on the grid, because he's Schumacher, he belongs on the grid. So I really like that, and it's going to be fun to watch him in a better car and see maybe what he can do. I think, though, for me, this is actually a very tough one because, I like Schumacher. In the upcoming 2022 season, Alex Albon is back. He's a great young driver who I think is a lot of fun, seems like a good guy. I really think George Russell, who's now been in F1 a few years already, it's pretty amazing given his age, he's really going to shine at Mercedes. I think, though, my favorite current younger driver, I would have to say, is Lando Norris. He's just a great talent. I think it was in Russia where he screwed up and made a bad call about tires that probably cost him a victory. And he really sort of owned up to it. He had a great season. He outraced his teammate, the veteran Daniel Ricciardo. He does, I think, a great job representing McLaren, representing the sport. So for me, I think it's going to be Lando.
Nice. I think that's a really good one. The other guy, the other young guy that we continue to talk about is Pierre Gasly. He's a lot of fun to watch too. And, he won a world championship this year, but we shouldn't forget that Max Verstappen is very young. He's younger than I am. I think he just turned 24, right? So, like, there's a lot of really incredible talent under the age of 25 being represented in Formula One, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, Max, you're right. I mean, it's sort of like he's like Kobe Bryant coming out of high school, already sort of setting the NBA world on fire, and he's 18. And, you're watching him 5, 6, 7 years into his NBA career and forgetting, he's 25. So I think, it's just amazing to see what Max is doing. Now, do you have a favorite race or track?
Yeah, this is a good one because I think there's so many just unique and exciting tracks. And I think sort of with the expansion of the sport into sort of new areas, we're getting to see newer tracks and sort of how the sport is developing. One of my all time favorites naturally has to be Monaco, but it's maybe not necessarily the best track for current F1 racing.
Right.
But, you know, city circuits or street circuits are so fun to me. And one that we have gotten to see the last several years and has always been an exciting race is Baku. I think that's an awesome track. We get high speeds and very low speed, tight corners, walls on either side. It's a really fun track and we get to see some really good racing there. That might be my favorite current track on the schedule.
That's great because, as we've mentioned before, we don't sort of coordinate our answers beforehand. And I think for me, Baku also. I know we're all supposed to say Monaco, and the setting is great, the history is there. It's a full weekend. It's all about everything that's F1, the driving, the cars, the glamour, the glitz. But I'm with you. The current cars in F1, it's hard to drive on that track in Monaco, at least as far as racing is concerned. It's very hard to overtake. But Baku, I think I'm not even sure I was aware of Baku before Formula One went there. And, those of us in the US who grew up, in the Cold War were sort of shut off to some of the great cities in Eastern Europe. And I mean, it just looks like right out of a fairy tale when I look at Baku. And then that track is so much fun. As you said, the tight corners, it's a street course. They're right up against walls, buildings. It's always fun. And even, this year, Max's tires go out. Lewis makes just an unbelievably uncharacteristically bad mistake that ultimately cost him his 8th championship. What a great track that is. I just love that setting, and I hope they go back every year for many more years.
Yeah, I think that's a great one just because it really showcases driver talent, which, is a big thing for me. And it's fun to see when the drivers have to be on it at all times. I think maybe it was Lance Stroll went off in qualifying and kind of screwed up the qualifying order. And then there was lots of shifting throughout the race this season and just some craziness. But it's really one of the most technical courses on the F1 calendar, I think. And it's just so fun to watch. I mean, there's plenty of them, though. Everybody likes to think about Spa in Belgium. That's a great track, obviously. One of my favorites this season actually was also in Saudi Arabia, the new track there. That was a wicked course. So, I'm excited to continue to watch sort of the development of new tracks and sort of what kinds of designs people come up with for new tracks or for different layouts that really help progress the sport.
Yeah, those are good, but related to that, they always have testing in Barcelona. Barcelona is one of my favorite cities. If you were going to go to an F1 race, it could be, anywhere that's on the calendar, where do you think you would go? Which locale do you think you'd want to go to?
That is a tough question because I would probably like to go to all of them. I mean, like even Miami, I'd love to go there.
That should be fun.
But yeah, there's so many good ones. I am thinking I forget all of the races next year because there's so many happening, but I would always love to go to the Japanese Grand Prix. That would be so fun to
Oh,
do.
yeah, yeah. I hope we get that back soon.
Yeah, that would be great.
For me, I think I'm sort of with you. I wanna go to all of them. I wanna go to all of those locales, see all of the races. I said Barcelona was one of my favorite cities. Possibly my favorite city in the world is Melbourne. And I know with COVID, that's impacted F1 in Melbourne, but I'd love to go back there. And it's such a great city, great people, great atmosphere. The whole weekend is fun. So I think as far as locale and fun, for me, it would be Melbourne, Australia. What about you mentioned at the start, one of the things you like about Alpine is the livery. Any favorite liveries? I know they change some drastically, some not so drastically every year, but any favorite liveries?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alpine probably is my favorite livery currently. That's a great one. I think they did a fantastic job
I'm with
when
you.
they rebranded that. I mean, I did like the Renault Yellow. That was a good one, but I think they did a great job with the Alpine rebrand. Williams consistently has a pretty cool livery. And then naturally, the papaya orange of McLaren, I think, is a really fun one. They stand out. I think that's been a really good one in recent years.
Yeah, as much as I love that McLaren colors, and I think they probably have my favorite colors as far as F1 gear, I'm not as big a fan of their liveries. I like them, but I'm with you. I think the Alpine this past season was great. I heard they are going to make BWT a sponsor, and so they might mess up their livery and put some pink in there. It's not that I'm opposed to the pink, it's just the livery this year was so great. Red Bull, I think, always does a good job. I'm not a fan necessarily of Mercedes colors, but they do a good job, I think. I'm trying to go through all of them. I like the AlphaTauri logo and those colors, but I think for me, I'm with you. The Alpine livery was the best this year. And I try to think back at some of the older ones, and it's funny because it seems like my memories are more of the main sponsor. Like
Yeah.
Benetton or Marlboro, for example, than the liveries themselves. So now, do you have any favorite F1 memory? It could be from this past season or any.
Ooh, favorite F1 memory. That is That's a good one. I feel like I wish that I had more, like really great memories, but I've been most of my time watching F1, at least half of it has probably been during this turbo hybrid era. And there was, not a whole lot of excitement for most of it. We just kind of got to see Mercedes dominate in such a way that there wasn't really anything crazy or exciting to watch. Hopefully that's changing. It seemed to this year. So, some fun memories that I have of this year and maybe last year as well are sort of the unconventional wins or surprise victories. Things like Ocon's win this year or Gasly in Italy. Those were really exciting and sort of fun, crazy races. I don't know. That's a hard question for me.
Yeah, for me, they all start to blend together. And I'll say, "Oh, remember the time Alonso did this?" And it was like, "Oh, yeah, that was, 2013 or something like that." Or,
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned, Mercedes dominating. There was Nico Rosberg start where, it was like, "Oh my god, is this the greatest start ever?" From this past season, I think Alonso's defense of Hamilton that allowed his teammate Ocon to get the win, because it just seemed he was doing the impossible. He was holding off Hamilton in a much faster car for many laps. It was watching someone have an amazing goal, and then they do it the very next play, and then again the very next play. You're thinking, well, there's something. This is I can't really be seeing what I think I'm seeing. So that was a favorite recent memory. And then there's, some of the heartbreaking memories, even just of the past year, Max, his tire blowing out. That was a race he should have won. I think that was Baku, as I mentioned before. And, I mean, what are you going to do? There's nothing. So those sort of like crushing memories are also like sort of stick with me.
Yeah, I think, the most vivid memory that I have of F1 is definitely not a favorite. It's really awful, actually. It was when Jules Bianchi basically crashed into the crane because I think 1 or 2 laps prior to that happening, I said out loud, "Why is this race not stopped?" And then 2 laps later, he goes and crashes and ultimately dies from it. And that I think sticks out in my mind more so than any other memory that I would prefer to be in that place.
That one sticks with me as well because I remember you saying that, and it was true. The conditions were such that it was dangerous. F1 has done such a great job, especially over the last 20 years, of making racing so safe, considering the speeds. There they were on a wet track, cars were skidding off that spot. They had a crane out there moving a car that had already skidded off there. I know there's a lot of controversy over, for example, this past season's call in Abu Dhabi where they wanted them to race, and so they sort of cleared traffic out. And I think in their mind was, well, we want this to end in racing, not under a safety car. We want to make things safe, so we'll clear things out. I know a lot of people think, well, maybe that wasn't the right decision, but there were a lot of primary thoughts going through that decision in Abu Dhabi, which is, as I said, let's clear these lap cars. Let's finish this great championship battle as a race, not under a virtual safety car. But with Jules's death, and this was this great guy, young, handsome guy from Monaco, driving in F1, solid driver. It was just inexplicable that they were out there. So, yeah, that's a sort of an unfavorite memory for me as well. Now, are there any favorites you have in the media or that are media related? So not just necessarily media personality, but TV show related to F1, site related to F1?
Hmm, interesting. I don't know if I do. I think that what Netflix has done has been, something that I have enjoyed at least seeing that has become sort of mainstream with their series and then with the Schumacher documentary that they did. I think both of those I sort of enjoy that is a thing now that is becoming sort of the sport is gaining a wider audience because of it. But I don't know. I think we see because sort of the only English speaking commentary and broadcast comes from Britain and Sky Sports mainly. That's sort of the only media coverage that I watch. And I think they're so favorable to British drivers and teams that occasionally it's hard to digest. So I don't know that I have any like specific media favorites just because of sort of that fact. There's only really one source that I get it from.
Right. I think I underestimated the impact of Netflix's Drive to Survive the first 2 seasons. You and I watch every F1 race. We get F1 TV. We're subscribers to that. And, we always watch the pre-show. We follow it online. And for me, Drive to Survive, I like it, but it was just sort of one more element. But it started sort of gaining appeal, and I started meeting more and more people who didn't even know what F1 was in the US. And they now love the sport. And so I think as far as impact, it's hard to overstate the impact that Netflix's Drive to Survive has had on Formula One, at least in the US, which has always sort of been the massive lucrative market that escaped Formula One. I do like F1 TV. We subscribe to that. And I also think they're trying to do a good job of sort of creating new shows. They package new shows where it's like, we're going to look at this historic race or this historic race, or let's do a technical breakdown of the last race and things like that. I think they could do much, much more. There are, in the US on cable television, 24/7 golf channels, tennis channels, hockey, everything. And I think Formula One TV should have really just sort of 24/7 programming, not just live races and then sort of packaged content after the race. I'd like to go on right now and hear them discussing something live, for example. So, as much as I like F1 TV, I think the opportunity is still just so huge that they're missing on. I also think, hey, someone wants to fund us. I would love an F1 magazine, a great F1 magazine, which I do not think exists. Just really high end, glossy, great photos, technical breakdowns, driver interviews, team principal interviews, all that great stuff. I'd love for that. Even though sometimes his walkthroughs before the race don't generate anything interesting, I love the Martin Brundle walkthroughs on the grid before each race. I love how Crofty says, lights out, but I love more Martin Brundle's insight. He doesn't talk too much, but he gives some great insight. I love how for example, the very last race, Abu Dhabi, Lewis sort of went off track to gain track position, and we all assumed he would have to give it back. And Martin Brundle says, of course he'll have to give it back. But he never did give it back. There was that little controversy over how that was handled. Martin Brundle always has some great insight like that. Even if, F1 doesn't follow it, he has great insight. He's always able to get some great interviews on the grid. And when he retires, I hope they give that task to somebody just as worthy, because that's one of my favorites.
Yeah. Overall, I think they do have a pretty good team, that broadcast team, including Martin Brundle. And I think, I also like Karun. He's pretty good. I think they have a number of guys who are drivers. I think Martin Brundle might be the only one that actually drove an F1, but there are drivers who understand the sport very well and can kind of give viewers insight into sort of what is going on and that kind of thing. And I think they do a very good job, but occasionally there is some overwhelming British bias that is a little bit unsavory for me.
It is. They'll always make the case that Lewis is the greatest, and then the two next greatest would be Lando or George, for example, because they're
Yeah.
they're British. That's funny. I'm trying to keep this positive on our favorites, but anything unfavorites, like for example, for me, I know this is a quibble, but I think I don't have a favorite sponsor. I think back of some of my memories over the decades of Formula One. And, like I said, Benetton was just burned into my brain. And Marlboro, for example, was burned into my brain. And now there's no sponsor that stands out. Red Bull is a product. It has nothing to do with automotives, with engines, with racing. Well, obviously with racing, but it's a drink. But they run a team. There are no sponsors that I think really stand out, which is sort of shocking to me given the global appeal of Formula One.
Yeah, I think there is sort of lost opportunity there. The only real big sponsors that you ever notice on any of the cars or things like that are, you see Pirelli, obviously, the sort of tire of F1. And I guess if you
BWT.
look BWT, you see Mercedes with Petronas, right? But there's nothing really interesting or exciting about any of the sponsors. It seems like, Ferrari has a big ass Mission Winnow on their
I think that's going away.
on their wing, and that's like a subsidiary of Philip Morris or something like that, right? So
Now, do you have any other sort of unfavorites and sort of to help spur you along? It's like, so for example, Kimi Räikkönen. Great driver, but for me, I never really warmed to Kimi Räikkönen. I thought he had a bit of a prickly personality, and I was never going to be one of those who sort of talked it up, like, "Oh, isn't this funny, Kimi being Kimi?" And I always thought, well, no, if, he either should sort of bail on giving interviews, but if he does, he should be forthright. I also thought, I mean, he sort of like Sebastian Vettel, the last few years, the drop off in ability was more noticeable than I think we should have expected. Any sort of unfavorites for you?
Unfavorites for me. I think, aside from sort of the occasional British bias, which would be an unfavorite for me, I think the constant desire to sort of make claims of like the greatest ever is really in sort of anything is really off-putting to me. I don't think that that's necessary, but it happens frequently, especially in F1 with Hamilton's numbers. You, I suppose, could make the case that he's the greatest driver of all time, but I think it gets stale very quickly. And so that is an unfavorite for me is just, constant goat talk.
Right, right. With Lewis, sort of like Tom Brady in NFL, he has so many of the numbers, and so I can understand why people wanna make that case, but when you start looking at cars over different eras, when you start looking at, he's in a car that's clearly vastly superior to all others, other teams, you have to sort of start thinking about, well, how do we measure pure talent, for example? How do we measure really who's doing the best in their car? And that becomes more difficult. So I tend to agree, even though, some of these are great bar discussions, greatest of all time, but once you leave the bar, I think there's really not much point to them.
Yeah, I think the other unfavorite that I would have has to be kind of this like notion for some people to like not want to progress with the sport, like they want to keep it as traditional as possible. So, they've complained this season about the sprints, which can be kind of a fun thing, I think. But, that's not traditional F1, so you can't do that or, the fastest lap point. You can't award an extra point for something like that. Those sorts of traditionalist views of the sport, I think, irk me a little bit because, there's so much potential to sort of entice more people to view the sport and to sort of reach a wider audience if you just adapt to the situation a little bit. So, those kinds of thoughts irk me a little bit.
Okay, let's box. You brought up, for example, some of the bias of the Formula One media, which is sort of centered in England, along with many of the teams. But I think we are witnessing a steady transformation where the center of gravity of Formula One is moving outside of Europe, outside of the UK, and into America. Now, I know a lot of the traditional fans may not like that, but I think it's been remarkable what we've seen over the past few years. And I want to get your thoughts on this. So, for example, Liberty Media, which was US based and initially run by the great John Malone, American, purchased F1. Netflix, Drive to Survive, that's an American technology company, tech media company. They are now having a significant influence on Formula One. I think we can make the case that for the next 10 years, the most influential team principal is the American Zach Brown. His lobbying to make changes to the race to, for example, on things like spending caps, bringing new sponsors, really promoting F1 through social media. I think there's social media, Twitter. These are American tech companies, for example. I can go down the list. ESPN now has taken rights for Formula One in the US. Plus, unlike in England or France, for example, starting in 2022, there will be two races in the US: Texas, Austin, Texas, and Miami, Florida. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think the center of gravity of Formula One is moving to the US, or is this just some sort of temporary media shift?
I think you make a very good point. I think that, it might be kind of hard to say. It seems like the economic center of gravity of F1 is shifting. Who's to say if that means that sort of the foothold is gained in the US? I think that's a very interesting question to ask.
I think McLaren has signed a very young driver. I think he's only 14. Here in the US and maybe in Europe with respect to soccer, we're used to really talented athletes being plucked out of high school in their teen years and put sort of on these programs because we think they have real potential to be professionals. McLaren has, I think, plucked out like a 14-year-old. He's American. Now, I know he does karting in Europe, but he's American. The rumors of the Andretti family in America still trying to buy a Formula One team. We might, within a few years, finally see an American driver in Formula One. But I do think there's a confluence of factors here of US media companies, tech companies, social media branding that are really pulling Formula One out of England and into the US.
Yeah, I think the US is, or North America in general, is a largely untapped center or base for F1. You think of two races next year in the US, but there's still only four races in North America versus, I don't know, at least seven or eight in Europe. I think there's at least five or six in the Middle East alone. There's still, I think, plenty of potential and room for growth in this part of the world.
Yeah, they had the current schedule. We still can't be certain it's going to happen because of COVID still, unfortunately, but there's two US races, Austin and Miami. We could, once again, in a year or two, see Montreal, Canada. Toronto has a big Indy race every year. That could be a great site. In the 80s, Las Vegas was the site of Formula One. That could be another great site. Mexico City. So you're right. North America is an untapped market, not just the US.
Yeah, I mean, you could even think of on the far west coast, Canada, you could do Vancouver, you could do Seattle, or further down the coast in California, you could do a Bay Area race. There's so much growth possibility, potential in the States. I think with the acquisition by Liberty Media of Formula One and sort of the gaining popularity of Netflix's series Drive to Survive, that growth is starting to happen. And I think with more American viewership, more North American viewership, there will be sort of more desire to host extra races in this part of the world. And I think, once that starts to happen, which it kind of already has with Miami, right? We'll definitely start to see that shift, I think.
Yeah, I think the 2022 calendar has 23 races, and a lot of folks are saying that's just too many. Having the teams be away from their families that many weeks, all that travel, that's just too many races. My view is that doesn't matter. I think Formula One is going to become more like US based pro sports, and that is having far too many games. The NBA season is far too long. The Major League Baseball season is far too long. Doesn't matter. There's just too much money there to pass up. And so I think we're going to, within a few years, have, for example, 26 race season. And we'll see what that means on as far as how do the pit crews handle it, the drivers, car reliability. But I think that's a big deal too.
Well, I think that's another interesting question to ask, though, is all of the teams are based in Europe. Most of them are based in Britain, right? Do you see any chance of a team moving, right? Like, what if the Haas team is like, well, okay, there's now 3 or 4 races in the States. Do they just move their entire operation to the States? I don't know. That could be sort of an interesting thing to take note
Yeah,
of.
you're right. That's a great point because I'm thinking of the sport in total and media and the center of gravity sort of moving slowly to the US. But you're right. Why not have a few teams actually set up base in the US with Haas to start, for example? That would be fun to see. I think another thing that Formula One, I've long proposed that they adopt, which is a very US notion, which is the hard salary cap in the NFL or a spending cap, I should say. It's not just salary cap; it's a spending cap. And I said this before: the reason NFL is the richest sport in the world, even though it pretty much doesn't exist outside of the U.S., is because every single week, almost any team has a legitimate shot at winning. Whereas in Formula One, especially during the turbo hybrid era, it was Mercedes was going to win, Red Bull would come in second, and then, maybe McLaren, Ferrari fight for third and fourth. Imagine if legitimately every race, let's say Haas had a 40% chance to win, Williams had a 45% chance to win, AlphaTauri a 50% chance to win. That would really shift just the whole concept of racing in Formula One. We've grown so used to over the past, not just even 10 years, 20 years of one or two dominant teams. And that doesn't really exist in the NFL. I'd love to see something like that happen in Formula One.
Yep, agreed. I think anything you can do to breed more competition is worthwhile. And I think that is something that Americans really crave. It is just competition and sort of knowing that anybody can win. And I think that would do F1 a lot of good. I don't really ever see that happening. There's just too much money at stake for teams like Mercedes or Red Bull to really allow that to happen. But I think that would be great to see because, you think about what teams are able to spend. And, I think of a team like Haas where probably like 30 to 40% of their budget is just spent on the powertrains that they can have. And if Mercedes and Red Bull spent 40% of their budget on the same thing, they would have, 600 engines that they could use throughout the season. I mean, it would be ridiculous, right?
Right.
So,
But you need to take, I think, these teams like Mercedes and Red Bull need to take a longer term view. So, for example, right now in the NFL, we're in the playoffs. Buffalo, a very small city, probably no one outside of the US has heard of it. They're in the playoffs and their team is worth more than $1 billion. Cincinnati, another small city in the US, most outside of the US probably have never heard of. They're in the playoffs. Their team is worth more than $1 billion. I mean, just the trajectory of revenue growth and value in NFL franchises since they adopted the hard spending cap has just been amazing.
yeah, well, you think of how many stadiums have been built in the last couple of years by NFL owners, and all of them have, I think, far exceeded $1 billion to build a single stadium, right? Like, it's insane. So, yeah, I think you're right. If teams have a long-term approach to, generating more revenue for themselves, they might actually think about implementing a hard salary cap type things. which I think would help tremendously in U.S. interest in the sport.
Yep. Okay, son. Great discussion. And I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to the world's most beloved father and son Formula One podcast. And we are lights out.
See ya. Thanks for listening.